Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the latest session in this term's Alumni Lecture Series. My name is Sophie Schermacher, and I'm the Alumni Relations Officer at Green Templeton. I've got one or two bits of housekeeping to run through first. Just to let you know, everyone will be muted throughout the session, but we'll be taking questions at the end of Michael's talk. Please be aware that we've had a few questions pre-submitted, so unfortunately, we can't guarantee that we'll be able to answer everybody's point, but we will do our best. I know many of you tend to turn your video off and prefer to have it off during these sessions, but actually it's very nice to see some friendly faces. So it'd be lovely if some of you did keep your video on. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Smets. As well as being an alumnus of the college, Michael is a governing body fellow of Green Templeton College and Professor of Management at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Michael ranked among the global top 40 under 40 MBA professors in 2016 and won the 2012 Academy of Management Journal Best Paper. His work is featured in the Harvard Business Review, the Financial Times, Forbes, Bloomberg, CNN, CNBC, and The Economist. Michael's talk is entitled How to Pivot Out of Crisis Mode. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this very kind introduction. And I hope you will forgive me that in light of current events, I have somewhat amended the title of my talk. Such was the planning for this session that when we considered in the autumn what would be interesting work to share and showcase with the college community, we were just about easing lockdown and moving on to kind of building back better. And yet here we are again, far away from pivoting out of crisis mode, but in a way we're pivoting back in. But actually that gives us some teachable moments, some moments of insight as well, how we deal with uncertainty as leaders. I will also say that as a business school professor, I am primarily interested or concerned with how organizations operate and how individual leaders operate in moments of crisis. Now, I have seen from some of the pre-submitted questions that you're expecting from me answers to how to save the NHS and how the US could manage the pandemic better. Now, personally, I would feel quite disrespectful to some of my colleagues in the college and actually to some people on the call who have far more experience and expertise in this area than me. So I'm afraid I will do neither of those, but I will share experiences from our research, but especially from lots of conversations over the summer with executives leading their organizations through the pandemic and hopefully providing you with a framework that you will find useful in your own leadership activities in your various organizations. So the framework that I like to use when guiding through those conversations to make sure that we're also moving from insight to impact, and which I invite you to keep at the back of your mind, is this notion about, okay, how does this actually help me think differently about my current situation? What's a mindset shift I should consider given where we currently are, again, at this kind of very pivotal point in how our economy and our society operates? But more importantly, how should that lead me to act? What am I going to do differently? What's the difference I'm going to make to the organization, the community, simply those around me? But almost more importantly, as many executives tell us when they come to the business school and they say, well, it's lovely that you tell us all these new things we need to learn, but sometimes it's more important to focus on the things we need to unlearn. And I think that is particularly critical when we are considering pivoting in and out of crisis, but especially when we're considering the bigger picture considerations of how do we build back better? What are the things we actually do not want to grow back to? What is this new normal actually? And what does it mean, not just in terms of new things we're going to, new ways of acting, and actually new structures we're going to create, but also what does this mean for the things we have to stop in our personal practice and in our leadership? So the key piece of research, and so we're obviously, the uncertainty of the COVID crisis is not new. We've lived in supposedly unprecedented times of change before, whether it's the impact of robotics and automation, artificial intelligence, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, life in a post-truth era, what actually still counts as a fact today. Now, people have argued that the world is changing faster than ever before, and then COVID came along and taught us in no uncertain terms that probably we didn't know the first thing about uncertainty yet. But this is, of course, the broader context in which we can test existing leadership theory. And so the key piece of research that I'm going to draw on with you today is a publication we call the CEO Report, which we drafted several years ago. We wanted to understand what it takes to lead a global corporation in the 21st century. And so we interviewed over 150 CEOs of global organizations, how they go about their work. Collectively, they have 880 years of experience, so 6.5 on average, not just in business, but in the top spot of their corporation. What is unusual about this study is that we did not survey these people, but we actually interviewed them face-to-face in a very personal and in-depth manner. On average, we sat down with them face-to-face for an hour, which is quite rare to find in the diary of a high-powered executive. And so in this, we had these very in-depth conversations, but also we reassured these people of complete anonymity, so there was nothing to be gained by aggrandizing their leadership skill, but there was also nothing to be lost by admitting that sometimes this work is very difficult. And while we have reassured these participants of complete anonymity, I've shared the picture of the panel who launched the report at the World Economic Forum in Davos at the time. The gentleman with the microphone is Matthew Bishop, the international editor of The Economist. Then we have Eileen Gordon, CEO of Ingredion, Arne Sorensen, the CEO of Marriott Hotels, and Klaus Kleinfeld of formerly Siemens, then Alcoa. Just to give you an idea of the caliber of people we spoke to develop this framework that I'm going to share with you, and which I hope you will find useful in navigating different leadership challenges in this crisis. And we asked them about change, and as I said, the perception always is that speed is faster than ever before. But the problem is that has probably been true for a long time. And so as one of our participants said, like, we need to be more worried about uncertainties that can affect us in a systematic, structural way, less concerned about micromanaging the effects of pace. And so suggesting that rather than being obsessed with the speed of change, we should be much more concerned with its scope. And again, in times of a global pandemic, that is definitely important, thinking about at the moment how the virus moves through different groups of the population, how it spreads, how we can isolate different countries. If you think about the notion of kind of local, regional, national, global scales, the notion of scope has really been thrown into relief over the past few months of the pandemic. But then they add to that and say, well, you have to begin to sort out the results. Are they kind of macroeconomic, industry, or enterprise specific? But then also think about not just how big is the impact that whatever trend you're dealing with is having, but you need to also think about how deep its impact is. You have to separate the noise and the normal stuff from more fundamental shifts. They're arguing that we need to think about significance. Think about a meteorite hitting the Earth. Let's hope that doesn't happen. In terms of on top of the pandemic, that would really probably be one too much. It's not just a question of how fast does it approach, how big is the crater, but also how deep is it? How deeply does whatever challenge we're currently facing in our leadership really shake the foundations, the values, the purpose of our organization or our community? And as you can start to see, this opens up a three-dimensional space in which we can start to chart different challenges we're facing. And we're not necessarily suggesting that for any one particular trend there is a single answer, but it starts a conversation about how we're framing the challenges we're currently dealing with. And that is essential to how we pivot in and out of crisis. So on the one hand, we can think about speed and kind of those things that are more evolutionary. They happen as a slower pace. You can see the challenges coming. You can brace yourself for impact, or you can build resilience. Think about the longer term challenges of, for example, public health initiatives or developing a vaccine. But then there are obviously very rapid challenges when we thought about in the first wave of the pandemic, the overloading of intensive care units, things that need a very, very rapid response. Thinking about scope, we very simply differentiate those challenges that are more contained. And we really keep this very simple. It's like anything that happens within a unit of one. So we can avoid the complexities of interactions between different systemic forces. And so we differentiate this from more systemic leadership challenges where multiple things come together. Now, critically, what counts as contained and what counts as systemic very much depends on the nature of your work and the seniority of leadership. I'll give you some examples in a moment. But then when we think about in terms of significance, there are those challenges that are more technical, and then there are those that are more foundational. Technical are those issues that we can typically address through a change in strategy, an operational tweak, whereas foundational is really where leaders have to reassert the purpose of their organization, the values that they stand for, the culture that they want to embody. Now, again, if we think about the pandemic, we can probably dot various aspects of it all the way across this cube. Think about, for instance, again, early in the pandemic, we celebrated great successes of organizations acting with great agility. We had a consortium led by Formula One teams suddenly re-engineering ventilators to address the crisis there. A very contained, very technical, very rapid response. Think about the celebrated gin manufacturer who moved to kind of producing hand sanitizers. Again, a very contained, a very technical solution to a much, much broader crisis. On the other hand, we then have the bigger systemic challenges of how to maintain the economy, the whole dilemma we currently face over lives versus livelihoods, which is both systemic but also very foundational. Lives, livelihoods, and liberties. It really does not get more foundational or fundamental to the fabric of our society than those kinds of questions. And so I just want to pause very briefly and give you personally the opportunity to think about your agenda, your diary over the past few months. Where did you spend the bulk of your time? During the first lockdown, for instance, when the crisis really hit for the first time. Think about those months when lockdown eased, when we thought that we were pivoting out of crisis and we were switching gears to building back better. And then, of course, where I hope this will be particularly helpful is to then understand, well, if we're moving back into lockdown, there's now a second wave. Do I pivot back to where I originally was, or have we actually built additional resilience in the organization to respond in a different way now? And this obviously has important ramifications for your leadership. Very simply, we differentiate three types of problems, actually originally coined by Keith Grint, a fellow of the college. So we describe those issues who are critical. And typically what leaders do is they command, they provide the answer. When we have tame problems, it's more a matter of organizing, so leaders manage. They organize a process because with sufficient processual capacity, the answer is discernible. However, when we face wicked problems, where we have a high uncertainty about the solution of the problem, but we also need to convene very broad coalitions of people who need to come together to achieve this solution, we need to lead more by asking questions. And of course, as you can probably guess, these map onto the cube fairly neatly. So pivoting into crisis, we notice that in the beginning, we have these celebrated successes where we commandeer even, these very short-term, rapid, contained technical solutions. And over the summer, it was interesting to hear those stories where people then said, well, we need to be quite careful now with our leadership. Because those successes are quite seductive. In many, many ways, when we went into lockdown, this experience was somewhat similar. Even though all our conditions are very different when we work from home, everyone was working from home. In the moment of crisis, it is appropriate for leaders to act in a more decisive way and in a more commanding way. Now, the problem is, now that we've had a lot of success, we've cut through red tape that we thought was unsurmountable before, we've moved to digital delivery, think about higher education at rapid speed. So many of the executives I spoke to said, look, we achieved within weeks what previously we had struggled with for years, if not decades. But that only works at the time of crisis, when there is this laser-sharp focus that aligns everyone on the solution to this particular aspect of the crisis. Thinking about pivoting out of crisis, this became much more tricky. As you will have realized in your own organizational or personal reality, think about all the confusion when different organizations brought staff back into the office. There were some hybrid models of some people work from home, others work from the office. The easing of lockdown happened in much more irregular fashions than moving into lockdown did. But also the question had to be, are those solutions that we found in moments of crisis, i.e. at the bottom left of this cube, are they actually fit for purpose? And so we now need to ask in a much more systemic way, do we want to maintain these solutions? Are they fit for purpose for the future? And are they fit for purpose for everyone? So leaders must resist the seduction of continuing to lead in crisis mode and in a very decisive way, adopt a much more systemic mindset, but also a much more foundational mindset, really thinking about what is this actually all about? And that means in the face of uncertainty or in the face of the question, how do we build back better? They need to lead. And that means we need to ask questions. Now, one of the questions that had been pre-submitted was, should there be or will there be more concern for larger societal concerns as we're building back better or pivoting out of crisis? And I am of the firm conviction that yes, we are. And there are two reasons why that is. On the one hand, we've seen many organizations act very rapidly and very radically to protect the bottom line when society was suffering. And the reputational backlash was huge. Think about some retail chains, for instance, benefiting from the furlough scheme on the one hand, but on the other hand, refusing to pay rent to shopping malls, for instance, because their shops could not be opened. Taking on the one hand from the public pocket, while refusing to pay on the other side, created a huge reputational damage. On the other hand, think about all the different societal concerns that started to intersect around the crisis. Originally, building back better was primarily associated with a more carbon neutral future. During lockdown, we traveled less, traffic resumed. Just outside my door, the bike lanes have been increased, areas have been pedestrianized, so everything became greener. Then it emerged also that despite very cynical initial claims, the pandemic did actually discriminate. So what was a health issue and then an economic crisis became a socio-demographic and deeply political issue. This, of course, then coincided with the violent death and the kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, which then here in the UK also morphed into the roads must fall. So suddenly, what was a health crisis and an economic crisis became a socio-demographic crisis and a general crisis of social cohesion and an ecological crisis. And so that is why pivoting out of crisis mode does mean thinking in more systemic ways about all the different socioeconomic, ecological aspects that kind of ripple together around this particular issue. And those issues are more foundational than simply maintaining the health of the public. So one way for you to consider this framework is, again, map your ownership of your agenda. Where are you currently devoting your time? And how effectively are you moving between the crisis leadership and the more inclusive, systemic, foundational leadership? As Ronald Heifetz called it, in his foundational work on adaptive leadership, how quickly can you get onto the balcony for the big picture systemic leadership and onto the dance floor, rolling up your sleeves and helping to solve a crisis in a very hands-on way. Make sure that you devote your time appropriately where you think you are more impactful. There is no right or wrong being here or there unless you feel that there are organizational dynamics that force you to pay attention where you think you're less impactful. It is well possible that you are needed to resolve the current crisis and you need to get stuck in the technical contained evolutionary work in the bottom left, and maybe you need to be more commanding. But that requires some very critical self-reflection on how long that is actually effective and when you're being seduced by being in your comfort zone or driving change in a more directive way. But what it also allows you to do is to think about how do you frame different issues more proactively. So far we've been thinking about how do we confront change and challenges that are brought to us from the outside in. But a more proactive, strategic, long-term response to the crisis also requires us to drive change inside out, reclaim our agenda and move from a more reactive stance towards a more proactive stance. And that means framing different issues. On the one hand, you can choose to address the challenges that your organization faces in a large, systemic, fundamental, foundational way. The risk is you might bite off more than you can chew. It may take a long time until you actually have something to show for your efforts, but it will be a very transformational change you are driving. By contrast, you could choose to break down this large challenge into smaller, more contained chunks. To think about pilots, where you can trial new ways of working, you can trial the new normal, and then as you learn about it, decide to roll it out on a larger scope. Now, this is actually something that we've seen quite frequently in political leadership around the pandemic. So very early on, actually going back to 2019, it's hard to remember a time before the pandemic, but the Australian Prime Minister, when the wildfires raged in Australia, was very much intent on scoping them in a very contained, regional, provincial way. It was not a national crisis. And he was heavily, heavily criticized for this approach. Now, while other failings may persist, he was very, very quick to learn from that. And when the COVID crisis hit, he was very quick to frame it as a systemic, foundational, nationwide crisis that he took ownership of as the head of state. So while he tried to manage the wildfires in a very technical, contained, and somewhat distant way, he embraced the COVID crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate strong leadership at a far greater scale. Similarly, it's what we're currently experiencing in the UK, but also other more federal countries. Think about Germany, think about the US. To what extent are responses to COVID contained within national levels, state levels, regional levels, and to what extent is that response coordinated at a larger systemic levels? That is where we see a lot of variation at the moment, where the link between the more systemic and the more contained is either stronger or weaker. We have examples where national responsibility is effectively devolved, so regional and local leaders can take more responsibility and be more responsive to local situations. On the other hand, we have those situations where the more systemic leadership and the more local one are actually at loggerheads because they're driven by different political beliefs, convictions, and faith in science. So here, we don't have leaders who effectively get onto the dance floor and onto the balcony, but we actually have leaders who kind of criticize those on the dance floor while being up on the balcony, if you will. There's kind of a big kind of conflict in the middle. When we think about how we're going to use this, think broadly about who do you need to have a conversation with to help you take charge of your agenda and be more proactive in responding to the crisis. That is the vertical, the y-axis, the scope. How big do you want to frame this problem? Who do you need to have conversations with? But then also think about the x-axis, the significance, because it determines the kind of conversation you want to have. Typically, technical conversations are more focused around questions of what or how. They are very IQ, whereas the foundational questions are typically much more centered around the why, around the EQ. Why is this the right thing to do? Say you may go for smaller wins and scale and frame your problem as something smaller, or you find the comfort of the discomfort of uncertainty, but actually address a more systemic challenge head on. As I say, I hope this framework will help you think about how you want to think about your leadership in and out of crisis. Consider how you want to act differently in the future. What are the things you want to stop as you're starting to build back better and pivot out of crisis? And what are the structures, cultures, or habits that you want to create within your organization or within your community with those around you? Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions, comments, and reflections.
Thank you so much, Michael. Lots to think about there. Very much enjoyed that talk. And we now can start some of the questions that we've had submitted. The first one is, does attending to the common good influence business planning in the pivot out of crisis?
Yes, definitely. As I said, because the pandemic, in contrast to other crises we had before, has such a strong economic and socio-demographic impact. It is not like the financial crisis, where the crisis had to be addressed on a financial and corporate level. But here the crisis really reaches deeply into our communities. And again, it raises these much more foundational questions around lives, livelihoods, and liberties. And so I think that the pivoting out of crisis, this notion of building back better, will actually require corporate leaders to take much more account of how they do so in a more socially responsible way. And I think we're starting to see initial signs of that. But I think society overall has become far less accepting in moments of crisis, that corporations just put profits first. They now have to think more broadly about profits, people, but also the planet.
Lovely, thank you for that answer. The second question, what is the effect of not changing your leadership style once out of crisis or chaos mode? Okay. What remains beneficial and what will disengage your team?
Yeah, so again, what we've heard in lots of conversations and very reflective conversations over the summer is that the successes some organizations have had early in the first wave of the pandemic may be quite seductive. Again, being able to cut through red tape very quickly, being very agile, accomplishing things that, that were not possible before. But again, more reflective leaders start to realize that that was really facilitated through the situation of the crisis and this kind of unifying experience. Now, when we come out of this, again, we need to become much more mindful of the plurality of our organizations, the plurality of our communities, and check whether the solutions we very quickly came up in a moment of crisis are actually fit for everyone. And so we need to take this more systemic consideration and as an individual leader, pivot out of this often very directive, commanding leadership style, because we need to take into account people's individual experiences. And so we need to become much more open, much more inclusive, much more affiliative as leaders. On that last point, I will specifically say that it is my firm conviction that the leadership superpower of the near future will be empathy, the ability to acknowledge and understand the situations that others are finding themselves in. I've seen some quite mind-boggling examples of that early in the crisis. I'll share the anecdote where I was working with some very senior corporate leaders who were very, very happy with their situation in lockdown. The fact that they were now working from home had basically gifted them several hours each day because they were no longer commuting. They found they had much better focus because they were being less interrupted than they would have been in the office. But interestingly, they had not thought about the fact that many of their staff, and not just the junior ones, would be flat sharing, that they would struggle to find a quiet corner in the house to take a Zoom call, that families, especially with small children and no outdoor space, would really be very confined. And it was really a revelation to some of these senior leaders that they had no understanding of what this new reality was for others. And again, as the workforce, hopefully going forward, will be granted more flexibility for our own benefits, that some of us may choose to do more work from home, others may choose to go into the office, or any kind of blend in between. It is really critical that we develop this understanding of what is the lived experience of those people working around us, because that is going to become a lot more diverse going forward. And that is why good leaders in this moment of exploration and uncertainty will prioritize asking questions over giving answers.
That's a very interesting answer, thank you. The next question we've had in is, how should leaders manage uncertainty and risk as we attempt to pivot out of crisis mode, given that so many factors are unprecedented?
It's a very nice follow-on, and I'll reiterate the notion for asking, or the importance of asking questions. And it's really probably the most dominant conversation we've been having over the summer. So one framework that sits alongside this one I just explained, we call this one the S-cubed model of change for kind of speed, scope, and significance. But one of the big surprises, even in the CEO report some time back, was what we termed the power of doubt. At the time, we really wanted to test for executive hubris, and we were very, very surprised that senior corporate leaders, in the privacy of the interviews, celebrated doubt as a catalyst for better decision-making. And of course, in this current it could not be more timely in this current environment. And that is questioning very carefully, what do we actually know? What do we assume? And to be very open about it. I think one of the key mistakes, and again, it comes back to this notion of kind of pivoting out of crisis. The key mistake is for leaders to pretend that they have all the answers, because literally no one does at the moment. And so while typically leaders are credited for vision, the grand vision that they're going to lead the organization towards, that is very difficult to do at the moment. And therefore, we think that many attempts to create a grand vision really lack credibility. So something we may want to consider as an alternative is the concept of holding the organization. Rather than pretending to know what the future will look like and pretending that you can take the organization there single-handedly, it is much more important to hold the organization and be with them in the moment. It's like, or we don't know what, but I will do my utmost to work out together with you how we can find those answers. And that will create a much more inclusive atmosphere. It will actually leverage a diversity of thought of an entire team. And it also galvanizes people, because it reminds the organization that leaders actually need support. If we as senior leaders pretend that we have all the answers and we can do it all ourselves, well, then we don't need help. And people will look at us and say, well, you go and do it yourself. But if you're a leader without followers, you're not a leader, you're just going for a walk.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one of the questions that's come in actually, which is from Catherine Bishop. Do you think it's true that some leaders are better in crisis and some better in larger scope systemic contexts?
I think so. I think people will have more of a comfort zone, and thrive in different kinds of conditions. Yes, and so you may even think about who leads through crisis. But that is also the key question, that especially those who may thrive in a moment of crisis, again, need to resist the seduction of extending this crisis mindset when actually it is time to change gear again and engage in more strategic, long-term, systemic, but also inclusive thinking. So yes, some of these approaches will come more naturally to some than others, and we need to be very reflective about our own preferences there and not let them get in the way of rigorous decision making.
Thank you. Another question that's come in: how can you pivot out of crisis mode when you work in a public service that is always in crisis?
Yeah, that's the bigger capacity question, and so I'll reflect on some of the conversations I've had over the summer, and one is kind of a bon mot that has been around for a long time, but this notion like never let a good crisis go to waste. And so if you find yourself in crisis mode and it kind of pinches you in that kind of bottom left quadrant or corner of the cube where you're continuously kind of caught up in firefighting, because you're lacking resources, you're doing kind of very contained and kind of what we call technical work. The notion is that you should always leverage that crisis to create urgency for larger systemic change. Typically, change efforts fail because leaders cannot articulate sufficient urgency why the status quo is unsustainable and why an alternative must be sought. So typically it's the role for leaders then to kind of create a sense of urgency and crisis. However, when we're actually in a genuine crisis, it's really important that we do not lose sight of this bigger picture and leverage this moment of crisis and leverage the genuine urgency of the situation to push for more large-scale change. Other thing that is also really important, that in these times of crisis, as the leaders who may have this kind of bigger balcony level perspective, always make sure that you have this golden thread from the overarching purpose, the value of the organization, down to what people on the front line actually do. I think one beautiful example, even if it was not senior leadership, was the clap for carers that we had for quite some weeks at the beginning of lockdown, where everyone reminded kind of NHS staff of their kind of gratitude, and we still see the NHS heroes hashtags and pictures around. And so that's obviously very powerful, but it is just to maintain morale during moments of crisis. But then the key thing is, again, as we pivot out of that, how do we build resilience in the organization so that the next crisis doesn't feel exactly the same?
Thank you. I'll go to one of the questions that's come in from Haimeng Shi. It seems that leadership is fitted into two dimensions, scope and significance. My question is how to fit into speed dimension, and she adds, is the S3 framework more qualitative or quantitative?
Okay, so it's definitely more qualitative in the sense it is not necessarily there to capture an objective reality, but to help you frame the reality that you start with. So we see many of executives using this as a conversation starter with their teams, for instance, to build a shared understanding of what they're trying to do. The speed dimension is, of course, the question, how do we respond? And again, in a moment of crisis, everything seems to accelerate. But I'll share with you a conversation I had with an executive from the publishing, academic textbook publishing business. And I shared with him this notion that the world is changing faster than ever before. And he fundamentally disagreed. And he said, that is even asking the wrong question. The question you have to ask yourself is, which part of my world is changing faster than ever before? Because you will find that not the whole world is changing faster than ever before. And to be perfectly honest, if you look around Oxford and the University of Oxford, you will see it at every corner, that there are parts of the world that are not changing very rapidly. But again, the key thing is to understand which part of your world is changing faster than ever before, because that allows you to direct your energy to those elements that are genuinely urgent. But it also means that you're not getting distracted by a hype that everything is urgent and everything needs to change faster than ever before, because that is typically not true. But it creates this risk that you get caught up in this kind of hype of doing everything faster, and you misallocate your energy to things that are made to look to be urgent, but they are not genuinely urgent or changing that rapidly. And so especially in moments of crisis, obviously the challenge or the key point is that we can focus all our energies where they're genuinely needed at the moment, but then as we pivot out of crisis, to reallocate that time, energy, and capacity.
Thank you. I'll go to quite an interesting question now that was pre-submitted. The year 2020 feels surreal. Could you help us visualize a better scenario of how the US government had reacted to the COVID-19 crisis?
You're suggesting they could have done a better job with COVID. Well, I think I tried to diplomatically allude to the disconnect that we there have between, again, the more localized, or call them contained, responses to COVID and the national response to COVID. You can think about the kind of very well-documented disagreements between the president, the mayor of New York, senators in New York and New York State, and other states in the US. So rather than arrive at a kind of unified yet devolved response to the pandemic, where you have a national umbrella that kind of then empowers local responses that are sensitive to the local needs, we had this kind of conflict between those responses that were informed by the local reality on the ground, but then a national response which often tried to deny those very realities. So again, speaking in the terms of the S-Cube framework and Ronald Heifetz, this notion of being able to get onto the dance floor, understand what is going on, and back into the balcony to create a more unified and systemic response, that is not really what happened. Also thinking about the kind of leadership at the top systemic level, leading into uncertainty, the notion that we should lead by asking questions. And lo and behold, we should probably lead by asking scientists questions and listening to their responses. That is definitely something there could have been more.
Thank you. Does anybody have any more questions that they'd like to put to Michael? Please feel free to add them to the chat box. We probably have time for, I would say, one more question. Okay, here we go, lovely. Are there any indicators leaders can look into in order to understand whether they've misjudged which quadrant their crisis falls on your chart?
Okay, very good point. And so again, building on my earlier reply that this is more of a qualitative framework than a quantitative one. The key indicator is posing your challenge to, for example, team members or even complete outsiders to your organization, and present them with this cube, outline the dimensions, like where do you think this particular challenge, trend, crisis should sit? And to listen particularly carefully when their diagnosis does not agree with your own. And the powerful question here is to just ask, what makes you say that? Because clearly these people think about the challenge that you're facing in some way that is distinctive, possibly even radically different from your own perspective. Especially if it is people close to you and in your organization, if they bring different perspectives, that can be incredibly powerful. On the one hand, because it helps you understand how the rest of the organization thinks about this issue. But on the other hand, because the resulting conversation can then also really help you to build a shared understanding and to galvanize the organization or your community around this particular issue. There are a couple of signals when it's almost a little bit too late, unfortunately. So clearly, when you misjudge the scope of the issue, it means that typically you have not included key stakeholders in the decision-making process, who then either have the ability to simply say no and throw a spanner in the works, or to very vocally disagree with you afterwards. So always the question is, when you think about how big you want to frame your challenge, when everything else is said and done, who could still say no? When it comes to the kind of conversation you should be having, whether it is a more technical or a more foundational one, there typically the signal is when people just find you, critical key terms are kind of tone deaf, lacking empathy, lacking understanding. That typically means that you have misjudged a more foundational issue as an overly technical one. But as I say, those are typically alarm bells that should go off when it's almost a little bit too late. But we need to listen to those very carefully, because then we need to urgently reorient our approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for that. I particularly love it when the dance floor is referenced in any lecture. So thank you for that. I don't think we've got any more questions that have come in now. So once again, I'd like to say thank you so much, Michael. It's been absolutely fascinating. Very wise words, as usual. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining this session. We really appreciate you all coming on, and it's lovely to see, I can see all your faces now. It's lovely to be able to see the audience. Just a reminder that this talk has been recorded, so you'll all be receiving a link so you can watch again at your leisure. And we very much look forward to seeing you throughout the rest of the series. We have 2 more lectures coming up this term, and we'll be sending you details in email, so do keep an eye on your inbox. And thank you once again.